The snow had risen past the doorframe, past the window ledge, nearly to the eaves of Gunnar Halvorson's cabin by the third day of the blizzard. Inside, warm and alive with weeks of supplies still accessible in his loft, he listened to the muffled sounds of Friedrich Weber's family screaming for help from the cabin 200 yards away, their voices growing weaker as the cold claimed them one by one. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1842 arrived in the Dakota Territory with deceptive gentleness. Gunnar Halvorson and his younger brother Oscar had built their cabin the previous summer along a creek that fed into the James River. The location offered everything they needed: water, timber, and beaver populations that promised profitable trapping. Their cabin was standard construction for the region. A single room measuring 16 feet by 20 feet, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace on the north wall, one door, one window, and a simple pole and sod roof. It had taken them 6 days to build, and they were proud of the work. By December, they had established productive trap lines and accumulated enough pelts to ensure a good profit when they traveled to the trading post in spring. Their food supplies were adequate. Smoked venison, dried corn, flour, salt, and coffee stored in barrels along the cabin walls. Firewood stacked outside near the door, enough to last through March if they were careful. Everything seemed secure. The cold snap came without warning on December 19th. The temperature had been manageable, hovering near 20 degrees when Gunnar went to sleep. He woke in darkness to hear wind howling against the cabin walls with unusual force. When he rose to feed the fire, he noticed his breath visible in the air despite the flames. The temperature had plummeted. Oscar woke as well, and they both worked to build up the fire, feeding it larger pieces of wood than usual. The fireplace drew well, and soon flames were leaping high, but the cabin remained brutally cold. They could feel heat radiating from the stones, yet the warmth seemed to vanish into the air above their heads. The single-level design meant heat rose directly to the ceiling and escaped through the countless small gaps in the roof construction. What warmth remained at floor level was inadequate against the killing cold that had settled over the territory. By dawn, they realized their situation was serious. The thermometer Gunnar had brought from Minnesota read -38 degrees. Neither brother had experienced cold of such intensity. Their indoor firewood supply was running low, and they would need to bring more in from the outside stack. Oscar volunteered to go. He was 24 years old, strong and confident. He dressed in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face, and pushed open the door against the wind. Gunnar watched him disappear into the whiteout conditions, heading toward the woodpile 15 feet from the cabin entrance. Gunnar found Oscar's body the next morning, 20 yards from the cabin, frozen in a position that suggested he had been crawling, trying to find his way back. The whiteout had been so complete that Oscar had become disoriented in the span of seconds, unable to see the cabin despite being close enough to touch it if he had walked in the right direction. Gunnar carried his brother's rigid body inside and sat with it for 3 hours before the reality settled into his mind with permanent weight. He buried Oscar 2 days later when the cold snap finally broke. The ground was frozen solid, so he placed the body in a natural depression on a hillside overlooking the creek and covered it with stones. He marked the grave with a wooden cross and stood there until his hands went numb. When he returned to the cabin, something had changed in him that would never change back. The cabin felt different now. Every time Gunnar fed the fire, he watched the heat rise and vanish into the upper air. Every time he stood up from his sleeping pallet, he felt the temperature difference between floor level and shoulder height. The warmth was escaping upward, wasted, lost to the roof. He began to understand that Oscar had not died because of the cold outside. Oscar had died because their cabin could not hold heat efficiently enough to prevent the desperate need for more firewood in the middle of a whiteout. Gunnar became obsessed with measuring temperature. He hung his thermometer at different heights in the cabin and recorded the readings throughout each day. At floor level near the fireplace, the temperature might reach 50 degrees when the fire was strong. At waist height, 40 degrees. At head height, 35 degrees. Near the ceiling, sometimes as warm as 60 degrees. The heat was rising and pooling uselessly against the roof structure before leaking out through gaps in the construction. He started sketching designs in a journal he had kept for trapline notes. The sketches were crude, but they showed a cabin with 2 levels. A ground floor for living and a loft above for storage. But more importantly, the loft would trap the rising heat and hold it like a reservoir. The warm air would be captured in the upper space, and the floor of the loft would act as insulation for the living area below. Heat would radiate down through the loft floor instead of escaping through the roof. Other settlers thought he was losing his mind. Friedrich Weber, whose cabin was 200 yards downstream, stopped by in January and found Gunnar sitting by the fire, staring at the ceiling, holding his thermometer at arm's length above his head. "You're grief-mad, Halvorsen," Friedrich said, not unkindly. "Your brother died. It's terrible, but you cannot bring him back by," measuring air. Gunnar lowered the thermometer and looked at Friedrich. "The warm air rises," he said. "It rises, and we lose it. If we built upward instead of just outward, we could keep it." Friedrich shook his head. "A cabin is a cabin, 4 walls and a roof. You build it strong enough to keep out wind and rain. That's all any man needs." Spring arrived in April of 1843, and with it came Wilhelm Brenner, a traveling carpenter making his way west from Minnesota. Wilhelm was a German immigrant who had learned his trade in the old country and now moved from settlement to settlement, offering his skills for food, shelter, and occasional payment. He was 60 years old, methodical, and carried tools that most frontier settlers had never seen. Wilhelm stopped at Gunnar's cabin on a rainy afternoon, asking for a meal and a dry place to sleep. Gunnar welcomed him, and over dinner of venison stew, Wilhelm noticed the sketches scattered across Gunnar's table. The old carpenter picked up one of the drawings and studied it in the firelight. "You are designing a 2-level cabin," Wilhelm said. It was a statement, not a question. Gunnar nodded. "Everyone says it's foolish, that it's wasted effort." Wilhelm set down the sketch and picked up another, this one showing a trapdoor in the ceiling. In Norway, they build stabber, small houses on stilts for storing food. The elevation keeps animals out and keeps food cold. Different purpose than yours, but the principle of using height is sound. He traced a finger along Gunnar's ceiling design. "You want to trap heat in the upper level and store supplies there," Gunnar said. "If snow buries the door, if ice seals the window, a man could reach everything he needs from inside the cabin. Food, water, firewood, tools, all accessible through a hatch." Wilhelm was quiet for a long moment, studying the drawings with the careful attention of someone who understood structural principles. "The floor joists must be strong," he finally said. "If you store heavy supplies in a loft, weak joists will sag, crack, eventually collapse. You need beams at least 8 inches thick, spaced no more than 16 inches apart, and you need them properly supported by the walls." Gunnar leaned forward. "How thick do the walls need to be?" "The same as any cabin, but the top logs must be selected for strength. No rot, no splits, no hollow sections. The weight of the loft floor and everything you store there will press down on those top wall logs. They must bear the load without compressing." Wilhelm pulled a piece of charcoal from his pack and began drawing on the back of one of Gunnar's sketches. "The hatch should be here, above your fireplace area. Heat rises most strongly there. The opening should be large enough to pass supplies through easily. 3 feet square, perhaps." They talked through the night. Wilhelm explained load calculations, joist spacing, methods for attaching loft flooring, and techniques for building a hinged trapdoor that would seal tightly when closed. He showed Gunnar how to calculate the number of logs needed and how to select them for consistent diameter. He described methods for cutting joints that would support weight without relying on nails, which were expensive and sometimes unavailable on the frontier. As dawn approached, Wilhelm prepared to leave. "Most settlers will not understand the effort this requires," he said. They will call it wasted time. A two-level cabin takes 3 times longer to build than a simple one-room structure. Gunnar began construction in June of 1843. He selected a site on high ground 50 yards from his original cabin, choosing elevation that would provide drainage and visibility. The foundation work alone took a week. He dug a shallow trench around the perimeter and filled it with stones, creating a level base that would prevent settling. Most settlers skipped this step entirely, but Wilhelm's instruction had been clear. A two-level structure required a foundation that would not shift. The first level walls went up using techniques Gunnar had learned when he and Oscar built their original cabin. He cut and hauled logs from a stand of pine 2 miles upstream, selecting trees that were approximately 14 inches in diameter and as straight as he could find. He stripped the bark completely and notched the corners using traditional saddle joints. By mid-July, the first level walls stood 7 feet high, and neighbors who passed by assumed he was simply building a replacement for his old cabin. Then Gunnar continued building upward, and the confusion began. Friedrich Weber rode over one afternoon and sat on his horse, watching Gunnar hoist another log into place atop the 7-foot walls. "What are you doing, Halvorsen?" Friedrich called out. "Your walls are already tall enough. You building a fortress?" "Building a loft," Gunnar replied, not pausing in his work. "A loft? What in God's name do you need a loft for?" "Storage. And heat." Friedrich shook his head and rode away. Within days, the entire scattered settlement along the creek knew that Gunnar Halvorsen was building something strange. By August, when the walls reached 10 feet and Gunnar began installing the massive ceiling beams that would support the loft floor, people started calling it Halvorsen's Tower. The name was not meant as a compliment. The ceiling beams were the most difficult part of the construction. Gunnar cut logs that were 9 inches thick and 16 feet long. Each log weighed well over 200 pounds. He rigged a simple pulley system using rope and a strong tree branch to help lift the beams into position. But even with mechanical advantage, the work was exhausting. He notched seats into the top wall logs where each beam would rest, creating cradles that would distribute weight evenly. The beams spanned the width of the cabin, placed 16 inches apart, as Wilhelm had instructed. It took 3 weeks to install all 12 ceiling beams. When they were in place, Gunnar had created a framework capable of supporting tremendous weight. Friedrich returned during this phase and stood in the cabin interior, looking up at the heavy timbers crossing overhead. "This is madness," Friedrich said. "You are building a cabin that could support a second cabin on top of it. Why?" "Because I will store supplies up there," Gunnar said. "Barrels of food. Firewood, water, everything a man needs to survive winter. We store supplies on the ground like every sensible person. Why would you haul heavy barrels up into the air?" The loft floor went down in September. Gunnar split logs into planks using a froe and mallet, a tedious process that produced rough but serviceable boards. Each plank was approximately 3 inches thick and fitted tightly against its neighbors. He left no gaps that would allow heat to escape upward through the floor. The planking took 2 full weeks, and when finished, he had created a solid platform 8 feet above the ground floor that divided his cabin into 2 distinct levels. The hatch was Gunnar's masterpiece. He positioned it directly above the area where his fireplace would stand, ensuring that rising heat would flow through the opening when the hatch was open. The opening measured 3 feet square, large enough to pass supply barrels through, but not so large that it weakened the loft floor structure. He framed the opening with double joists, creating a strong border that would bear the weight of foot traffic around the edges. The trapdoor itself was constructed from the same thick planking as the loft floor. Gunnar fitted 6 boards together using tongue and groove joints he had painstakingly carved by hand. The result was a solid panel that would not warp or separate. He reinforced the underside with 2 crosspieces made from oak, attaching them with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The door weighed nearly 40 pounds, heavy enough to stay closed on its own, but manageable for one man to lift. The hinges were the most expensive part of the entire cabin. Gunnar had purchased 2 iron strap hinges from a trader passing through in August, paying 3 beaver pelts for hardware that most settlers would have considered an extravagant waste. But iron hinges would not rot like leather, would not break like wood, and would last decades. He mortised the hinges into both the trapdoor and the frame, then secured them with iron pins. The door swung downward into the living space below, opening smoothly despite its weight. Around the edges of the hatch frame, Gunnar installed weather stripping, using strips of leather backed with wool. When the trapdoor closed, the leather compressed against the door edges, creating a seal that prevented drafts. The fit was tight enough that a feather held near the closed hatch showed no movement from air currents. The operating mechanism was simple but clever. Gunnar attached a rope to the lower side of the trapdoor and ran it through a pulley mounted to a ceiling beam. The rope hung down into the living space, allowing him to pull the door open from below without needing the ladder. A counterweight made from a canvas bag filled with stones hung on the opposite end of the rope, balanced to make opening the heavy door easier. When released, the door would lower slowly rather than slamming shut. He also installed a secondary release mechanism accessible from the loft. A wooden lever mounted near the hatch could disengage the counterweight rope, allowing someone in the loft to close the hatch even if the lower rope was blocked or frozen. The ladder was Gunnar's final innovation. He constructed it from 2 straight pine poles 8 feet long, serving as the vertical rails. But instead of using wooden rungs, which would creak under weight and could crack in cold weather, he drilled holes through both rails at regular intervals and threaded thick rope through them. The rope rungs were spaced 12 inches apart, comfortable for climbing, and Gunnar knotted them securely on the outside of each rail. The rope provided flexibility that absorbed the shock of each step, making the ladder quiet to use. The fiber would not slip under a boot sole the way smooth wood sometimes did, and if a rung ever wore through, it could be replaced in minutes without tools. Gunnar leaned the ladder against the loft edge, and it became a permanent fixture of the cabin interior. By October of 1843, Gunnar began stocking the loft with supplies. He approached this task with the same methodical care he had applied to construction. Everything he stored above had been selected based on weight distribution, accessibility, and survival priority. He was not simply filling a storage space. He was creating a cache that could sustain him through catastrophe. Food went up first. He hauled smoked venison wrapped in canvas, placing the bundles along the outer walls of the loft, where the weight would press directly onto the main support beams. Dried corn in cloth sacks stacked beside the meat. Hard biscuits, packed in tin containers that would keep moisture out and rodents away. Salted fish, dried apples, flour sealed in waxed barrels, coffee, sugar, and salt. Enough provisions to feed one man for 4 months if necessary. Water storage presented a challenge. Water was heavy, and barrels could freeze and crack in extreme cold. Gunnar's solution was to store smaller kegs rather than large barrels, distributing the weight across multiple containers. He filled 8 5-gallon kegs and placed them strategically around the loft perimeter. If winter trapped him inside, he could melt snow for additional water, but having liquid water accessible would save firewood and effort. Firewood filled one entire corner of the loft. Gunnar split and stacked oak and maple, dense hardwoods that would burn hot and long. He arranged the wood in rows, leaving gaps for air circulation to prevent rot. The stack represented approximately 6 weeks of continuous heating if he burned conservatively. Combined with the firewood stored outside near the door, he had enough fuel to last through even an extended winter crisis. Additional supplies filled the remaining loft space. Extra blankets and clothing, a second axe, rope, candles, a fire striker and char cloth, needles and thread, leather for repairs, cooking pots, a spare hunting knife, and a small box containing medical supplies including yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, and clean linen for bandages. Everything a man might need if he could not leave his cabin for weeks. The neighbors who witnessed this stocking phase thought Gunnar had lost his mind entirely. Ingrid Lindstrom, a widow who lived a mile upstream, stopped by one afternoon and watched him hauling another barrel up through the loft hatch. "Are you preparing for the end of the world, Gunnar?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I am preparing for winter," Gunnar replied, lowering the barrel onto the loft floor. "But why store everything up there? We all keep our supplies on the ground where they are easy to reach." Gunnar climbed down the rope step ladder and faced her. "If snow buries the door 10 feet deep, can you reach your supplies?" Ingrid frowned. "Snow does not bury doors 10 feet deep. That is not something that happens." "It happened to my brother," Gunnar said quietly. "Not the snow, but the cold. The cold came, and we needed firewood, and Oscar went 15 feet from the door and never came back. If I had everything I needed inside, accessible without opening the door, he would still be alive." Ingrid's expression softened. "I understand your grief, Gunnar. But you cannot build your life around preventing something that has already happened." Gunnar did not argue. He simply climbed back up the ladder and continued his work. Ingrid left, shaking her head, and Gunnar knew she would tell others about his strange behavior. He did not care. The loft was full, the hatch mechanism worked perfectly, and his cabin was ready for whatever winter brought. December of 1843 arrived with unusual weather patterns. The first weeks were mild, with temperatures hovering near freezing and only light snow accumulation. Settlers commented on the pleasant conditions and predicted an easy winter. Gunnar said nothing, but he watched the sky with attention born from his previous winter's experience. The clouds had a quality he recognized, a heaviness that suggested something building beyond the horizon. The storm arrived on December 21st. It began with temperature dropping rapidly over the course of a single afternoon. By evening, the thermometer outside Gunnar's window read 18 degrees. By midnight, 4 degrees. By dawn on December 22nd, minus 12 degrees, and snow had begun falling. The snow came down steadily through the morning, thick flakes that accumulated quickly. By noon, 4 inches covered the ground. By evening, 12 inches. The wind began to increase after dark, and Gunnar could hear it building in intensity, howling around the cabin corners with growing force. He fed his fire and settled in to wait. His cabin was tight, well chinked, and the fireplace drew cleanly. Heat rose from the flames, passed through the open loft hatch, and filled the upper space. The loft floor radiated warmth back down into the living area, creating a circulation pattern that kept the entire cabin comfortable. Gunnar monitored his indoor thermometer and noted 55 degrees at floor level, 60 degrees at head height, and when he climbed to check, 68 degrees in the loft. The thermal stratification was working exactly as he had planned. The storm intensified through the night. Wind speeds increased until the cabin walls shuddered under the force. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to 0. Gunnar woke several times to feed the fire and check conditions outside his window. By dawn on December 23rd, he could see nothing through the glass except white. Snow had drifted against the window, covering it completely. He opened his door to assess the situation and found snow packed solid against the frame, reaching above the door's midpoint. He pushed hard, creating a small opening, and a wall of snow collapsed inward. The drift outside was already 4 feet deep and building. Gunnar closed the door quickly, securing the wooden bar across it, and accepted the reality. He would not be leaving through that door until the storm ended. The storm continued without pause through December 23rd and into the 24th. Gunnar watched through cracks in his window shutter as snow accumulated beyond any depth he had previously witnessed. The wind created drifts that rose and shifted like ocean waves frozen in motion. By the afternoon of the second day, his window was completely buried, invisible beneath packed snow that pressed against the shutters from outside. Inside, Gunnar remained comfortable and unconcerned. When he needed food, he climbed the rope step ladder, opened the loft hatch, and retrieved dried venison and hard biscuits from his stores. When he needed water, he carried down one of the 5-gallon kegs. When the firewood stack beside his fireplace ran low, he climbed up and lowered split logs through the hatch, restocking his ground floor supply without ever approaching the buried door. The rhythm of survival became routine. Feed the fire every 3 hours. Climb to the loft twice daily for food and water. Monitor the indoor temperature, which remained steady between 50 and 60 degrees, despite the killing cold outside. The cabin's two-level design created a thermal buffer that required far less firewood than a single-level structure would have demanded. Heat rose into the loft, where it was trapped and held. The loft floor prevented that heat from escaping through the roof, instead, radiating it back down into the living space. The system worked with elegant efficiency. On the afternoon of December 25th, the third day of the storm, Gunnar heard sounds from outside that made his blood stop. Voices, muffled by snow and wind, but unmistakably human, screaming. He moved to his door and listened. The sounds came from the direction of Friedrich Weber's cabin, 200 yards downstream. The screaming was high-pitched, terrified. Children's voices, mixed with adults. The words were indistinct through the barrier of snow, but the desperation was clear. Gunnar stood at his door, hand on the wooden bar, calculating possibilities. Friedrich's cabin was single-level, standard construction. If they were screaming, something had gone catastrophically wrong. He considered attempting to reach them. The storm was still raging. Visibility was 0. Snow depth was already past 6 feet in the drifts, perhaps 10 feet in places. The temperature was certainly below -30 degrees, with wind chill factored in. To leave his cabin would mean fighting through drifts that would be over his head in places, in whiteout conditions, in cold that could kill in minutes. He would become disoriented just as Oscar had, except this time there would be snow deep enough to bury him completely if he fell. The screaming continued. Gunnar could hear Friedrich's voice now, deeper than the others, shouting something about cold, about fire. The words were fractured by wind, but the meaning was becoming clear. They had run out of firewood. Their indoor supply had been exhausted, and their outdoor stack was buried beneath drifts they could not dig through. They were burning furniture, clothing, anything that would create heat, but it was not enough. Gunnar placed his forehead against the door and listened to them die. The screaming grew weaker over the course of 2 hours. The children's voices faded first, then Friedrich's wife. Finally, Friedrich himself, his shouts degrading into hoarse calls, then silence. By evening, there was no sound from the direction of the Weber cabin except wind. The storm continued for 2 more days. On December 27th, the wind finally began to diminish. By December 28th, the snow stopped falling, and the sky cleared to a brilliant hard blue. The temperature remained brutally cold, -20 degrees even in full sunlight, but the blizzard had passed. Gunnar waited an additional day for conditions to stabilize before attempting to leave his cabin. On December 29th, he climbed his rope step ladder to the loft and examined his options. The door was impossible. Snow had drifted against it to a depth he estimated at 12 to 15 feet. The window was similarly buried, but during construction, Gunnar had installed a small ventilation hatch in the loft ceiling, a feature he had added almost as an afterthought to allow hot summer air to escape. That hatch opened upward onto the roof. He pushed the vent. Hatch open, and looked out onto a transformed landscape. Snow covered everything in smooth, wind-sculpted drifts. The depth varied wildly. In some areas, bare ground showed where wind had scoured snow away completely. In others, drifts rose 20 feet high, erasing all familiar landmarks. Gunnar's cabin roof was partially buried on the downstream side, where prevailing winds had created a massive drift, but the upstream side was relatively clear. He widened the vent opening enough to climb through and pulled himself onto the roof. The cold hit him immediately, searing his lungs, but he was dressed in layers and could tolerate brief exposure. From the roof, he could see the other cabins in the scattered settlement. Most were completely buried, visible only as irregular mounds in the snow. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, his own and one other about a mile upstream that belonged to Ingrid Lindstrom. Friedrich Weber's cabin was silent, no smoke. Gunnar stared at the mound that marked its location and felt nothing. He had listened to them die and had been unable to help. That was the simple truth of frontier life. Sometimes people died within shouting distance, and there was nothing anyone could do. He spent 2 days digging down to his door from the outside. The work was exhausting. He would dig for an hour, retreat to the loft, vent to warm himself inside, then return to dig more. The snow was packed dense by wind, almost like ice in places. By the afternoon of December 30th, he had cleared enough to open his door from the outside. The cabin interior was exactly as he had left it. Warm, dry, supplied with everything he needed. On January 2nd of 1844, when the temperature finally rose above zero, Gunnar walked to Friedrich Weber's cabin. The drift against Friedrich's door was enormous, at least 18 feet at its peak. Gunnar dug for 4 hours before he broke through to the door. He opened it and found what he expected: 5 bodies frozen in positions that told the story of their final hours. They had burned their table, their chairs, one of their sleeping platforms. The remains of furniture lay scattered in the fireplace and across the floor. It had not been enough. The single-level cabin had lost heat faster than they could generate it, and when their firewood ran out, the cold had claimed them quickly. Gunnar walked to the other cabins over the next week as temperatures moderated and snow began to settle. He found 11 dead in total. 4 families and 2 single trappers, all frozen in cabins that had become tombs when the storm buried their doors and exhausted their accessible firewood supplies. The only other survivors were Ingrid Lindström, who had kept an unusually large supply of firewood stacked inside her cabin, and Klaus Richter, whose cabin had been positioned where wind kept his door relatively clear. The 3 survivors met at Ingrid's cabin in mid-January. Klaus Richter was a practical man in his early 40s, a Bavarian immigrant who had survived through luck of location, and he knew it. "Your cabin," Klaus said to Gunnar. "You were never in danger, because of the loft. Because you had everything stored above, accessible from inside. I want you to explain exactly how you built it." Gunnar spent 3 hours describing his construction techniques. He explained the thermal dynamics, how heat rose and could be trapped in an upper level, how the loft floor acted as insulation below. He detailed the hatch mechanism, the rope step ladder, the methods for storing heavy supplies safely in an elevated space. Klaus listened with absolute attention. "I will rebuild," Klaus said finally, "with a loft and hatch. It will take all summer, but I will not face another winter in a cabin that can trap me." Ingrid hired a carpenter that spring to add a loft to her existing cabin. Word of the blizzard death spread through scattered settlements along the James River and beyond. Trappers and settlers who heard the story learned that only 3 people had survived, and one had done so in complete comfort with months of supplies remaining. When they learned about Gunnar's 2-level design, some dismissed it as excessive. But others, especially those who had experienced close calls during severe weather, began asking detailed questions. By 1846, at least a dozen cabins in the Dakota Territory had been built with accessible lofts and ceiling hatches. The designs varied, but core principles remained consistent. A raised storage platform that doubled as a thermal buffer, a hatch large enough to pass supplies through, a ladder for easy access. The technique became known as a Halverson loft. By 1850, 2-level cabins with accessible lofts had become standard construction in parts of Minnesota and Dakota territories where severe winter storms were common. The phrase "built with a storm hatch" became shorthand for quality construction that prioritized survival. Gunnar left Dakota Territory in 1852. He purchased land in eastern Minnesota, married a Norwegian immigrant woman named Astrid in 1854, had 3 children, and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his time in the territory or the cabin he had built. He died in 1869 at age 48 from pneumonia. Astrid buried him in the churchyard near their farm. His gravestone made no mention of Dakota Territory or innovative cabin design, but his legacy persisted. Modern historians estimate 20 to 30 lives were saved over the following decades because people built cabins with accessible storage that did not require going outside during storms. The pointless hatch that became essential. Engineering over heroism. One man's grief transformed into design that saved dozens. His name forgotten, but his innovation carved into ceiling beams across the frontier.